In a sharp contrast to what is taking place in China, a warning from former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. He said in an op-ed yesterday the U.S. could be in for a lost decade reminiscent of what Japan went through in the 1990s. Now, for more on the stakes for the U.S. economy, we welcome Niall Ferguson. Niall is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and best-selling author of books, including The Ascent of Money. He is also our newest contributing editor here at Bloomberg. Niall, finally, you're in New York City.
Yeah,
great to have you here.
Back.
So I'm sure you read what Larry Summers had to say yesterday. The U.S. facing a lost decade. Is he right? Well, in fact, that we're already halfway into it.
But he's certainly not the first person to make this argument. Pessimists who've worried about deflation have been making it for some time. Indeed, if you go back a few years, it was one of the reasons that Ben Bernanke was very aggressive in cutting rates to stave off this threat of deflation. But, you know, my former Harvard boss, Larry, is somebody for whom I have the greatest respect, and we have to take this seriously. I think I'm 50% on the same page as him. There is a major problem here, which is the aftermath of a huge leverage-driven bubble. And it's very hard to bounce out of that process because as households deleverage, they naturally don't rush back to the shopping mall. So I agree with that part of the analysis. This is different from all the post-war recessions that we've seen before. But where I'm a little skeptical is the proposed remedy, which is essentially more Keynesian stimulus. And much as I respect Larry, and he's one of the world's great economists, I am doubtful that even if he were alive, John Maynard Keynes would agree with that analysis, because I just don't think there's the room for maneuver on the fiscal side.
Niall, you're a historian. You spoke about how this time is different than any other post-war slump. What about being Keynesian here and adding more stimulus has shown in the past to work?
Well, let's remember that part of what made the 1930s so ugly, part of what made Japan's lost decade so ugly, was not just a lack of stimulus. There were structural reasons for unemployment, structural reasons for low growth, and this wouldn't necessarily be corrected by yet more deficits and yet more spending. After all, Japan has run up a mountain of debt, far larger in relation to GDP than the US, trying to get growth to happen, and it hasn't happened. Why not? Well, it's partly demographics. Now, that's less of a problem for the United States, of course, but there are other issues which make it hard to get unemployment down below 9%. For example, the great shock of China's entry into global labor markets over the past decade or so really can't be underestimated. I would say that we juiced up growth in the first part of this new century with leverage. And that really got us as far as we could go. If you strip out the effects of household leverage, of refinancing, and withdrawal of home equity, the trend growth rate of the United States in the Bush years was really much lower. And so my sense is that this is more of a structural problem than Larry Summers is acknowledging. And for us to play yet more Russian roulette with the bond market won't necessarily solve those problems.
So what would the anti-Keynesians propose, Niall, as a recipe for the U.S. economy? The Hayeks, the Milton Friedmans, what would they say we need to do now?
Well, I think there are two different answers to that, because Friedman's answer we've kind of seen put into practice already. I mean, Friedman said the depression's a monetary phenomenon, it's all down to the Fed. If the Fed was aggressive enough, we'd have got out of the depression. Well, we've seen a very, very aggressive Fed, more aggressive than anything Milton Friedman would ever have anticipated. And guess what? That didn't work any more than zero interest rates worked in Japan. We've avoided a Great Depression. Let's not oversimplify this. We could be in a much worse place than we currently are, but clearly we're not growing as fast as we could be. Now, the Austrian or Hayekian answer to the question would be, if it's a structural problem, you need to do things to incentivize the private sector to want to employ people. And here I think we need to look much more closely at the tax structure, the way it works, the incentives to work, and above all, the incentives to employ. Now, this is something Larry Summers mentioned in his piece. I think it needs much more attention because it's something that it seems to me neither Democrats nor Republicans are really thinking hard enough about. It was there for a time in the debate. Remember a few months back when Paul Ryan talks about it, and it seemed like Barack Obama, the president, agreed with him. This was the one area where they seemed to be on the same page, that we could rationalize the tax system and make it more attractive to employers. That has kind of faded away in this whole argument about the deficit and the debt ceiling. And I think we need to get back there and ask ourselves, why would you hire in America today, and what can we do to make it more attractive?
As promised, we are back right now with Niall Ferguson. He is a Bloomberg contributing editor, Tisch Professor of History at Harvard, visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and last but not least, right beside Erik and I, right here in the newsroom. Niall, we're so glad to have you with us. We talked a lot about the U.S. a few moments ago. What about this public spat between the ECB and Germany. What does it mean for Greece? The fact that the ECB and Germany are actually just fighting in front of all of our eyes.
Well, whenever you're feeling down about the US economy, take a look at Europe and feel cheered up. This is pretty serious, actually, and we've been talking, of course, for more than a year about the travails of Greece, not to mention the other so-called pigs, or are we supposed to call them gypsies? I don't know which is nicer. But the key point here is that this has moved from being a crisis of public finance on the periphery to being a major institutional conflict between the biggest economy in the European Union and the European Central Bank. And I think if you look at what is being said here, you realize just how big an impasse we're now in. It's very, very hard to see common ground when the ECB absolutely rules out any kind of default-like event, credit event that might happen if private holders of Greek debt were to take a haircut, and the Germans say, we won't agree to anything else because we're not writing any more blank checks.
How on earth, Neil, did we get to a point where the Greeks and the Germans effectively want the same thing?
Yes, this is an interesting development which suggests that it's the German position that really has moved. The driver here is the German voter. You have to recognize that the most important player in all of this is a disgruntled Christian Democrat in southern Germany, the political heartland of Chancellor Angela Merkel, but it's a heartland in revolt. This, remember, is the real economic engine of Europe. It's not just Germany, it's not so much Germany here, it's South Germany that is growing while the rest of Europe languishes. And these prosperous South Germans just are fed up of writing checks for people on the European periphery that they regard as frankly indolent. So their attitude is, why should we carry on writing blank checks? And we definitely don't want to get into some federal type deal where we're automatically bailing out the periphery. Therefore, there has to be some sacrifice by the people who invested in this debt on the private market back in the good days. Now, the problem is that this German voter doesn't see that among the holders of Greek debt, not to mention Portuguese and all the rest, are German banks. And so the interesting twist in the tale here is that it's the law of unintended consequences. If the German voters get what they want, which is a haircut for bondholders, a whole bunch of German banks could blow up, and those poor old German voters could find themselves paying out again, only this time to German banks.
Let me ask you a crazy question. I was speaking with somebody here this morning who's a Greek citizen, but he also works here as well, and he said, you know what, Greece should just default. This is the easiest thing. Argentina did it, they came back. Ecuador, they did it, they came back. What is the argument against it?
And he could have gone further. He could have said Greece did it, because the history of Greece, if you go all the way back to the early 19th century when Greece regained its independence, is a history of defaults. There was a spectacular blow-up in the 1870s, for example. So it's certainly not the first time this has been on the agenda. And when this all began over a year ago, I said, if I were Greece, I would just default, because the alternative is you're put through this fiscal mincing machine of what we call austerity, but it's much worse than that.
There's no growth there,
Yeah.
and he said, I mean, there's 46% unemployment for the youth. I mean, there's nothing going on.
And so a certain point will be reached when politically this strategy is no longer viable. And if I were looking to make my name in Greek politics right now, I would be saying, let's get the hell out, take the consequences, anything is better than this. And remember, just around the corner, there's another nightmare scenario. And that's the scenario that Greek finances come under direct control of, well, it would be the Europeans, but in practice it would be the Germans. Now, financial control of your finances is way worse than giving away monetary sovereignty. That means your whole tax structure, that starts to be dictated from abroad. And I don't think there could be any political appetite for that in Greece today. So it seems to me that there's something that could blow up here at any moment. And it's probably a Greek politics. It's probably that moment when you discover, oh, the Papandreou government has in fact gone, and there's a new government that's just announced the return of the drachma.
All right, on a scale of 1 to 10 quickly here, Neil, how likely is it that Greece defaults? 100%.
It's 100% certain that Greece will default. The only question is what euphemism will be dreamt up to cloak the fact that it's a default. And the race is on to find a way of saying Greece hasn't really defaulted, even though it's not making good on its interest payments. Good luck with that.
Neil, we're so glad to have you here with us in New York. Niall Ferguson joining us there, right here, 3D. Happy to have him here. All right. Well